In this episode, we're talking with Brad Walters from Equifax, and we're going to explore the declining confidence in the construction industry and how to spot trustworthy builders and developers that have a track record of doing the right thing. What should buyers be thinking about when looking at prospective homes to ensure that they're getting a quality building, particularly when looking at a new property or off-the-plan apartment? The stakes are high, but the quality of information is very low. How can buyers make better decisions when they're often in the dark with limited intel to base those decisions on?
Welcome to The Elephant in the Room. This is the podcast where we love to talk about the big things in property that never usually get talked about. I'm Veronica Morgan, real estate agent, buyer's agent and buyer's agent mentor, co-host of Foxtel's Location Australia, author of Auction Ready and co-host of Your First Home Buyer Guide.
Hi, I'm Chris Bates, mortgage broker, currently ranked number 3 in the MPA Top 100 Mortgage Broker Awards. Before we get started, everything we talk about today is not personal advice, and we recommend you engage the services of a licensed and experienced professional.
Our guest today is Brad Walters. He is the head of product and rating services at Equifax, a global data analytics and technology company. And Brad is also the chair of the independent construction industry ratings tool, which is iCIRT. For the last 25 years, Brad has advised banking institutions, insurance organisations, large corporations and government departments on commercial due diligence, credit risk measurement and supply chain management. And he's contributed towards public sector reviews and government inquiries on insolvency in the construction industry. And today we're looking forward to him sharing the latest data and insights on the construction industry and how iCIRT is supporting property buyers and building confidence for all market stakeholders. So this is a big conversation. We're looking forward to it. Welcome, Brad.
Thanks, Veronica. Pleased to be here.
Brad, so thanks so much for coming on. I think this is, getting close to 400 episodes, and we love new topics. And I don't think we've delved deep in this at all in nearly 400 episodes. So that's on us, but we're so excited for you to be here. I mean, building defects, insolvencies, there's so much that goes on within the construction space. I mean, what is the iCIRT tool, I guess, and just how important is it in today's sort of construction industry?
A good opener, I guess, Chris. Look, it's an interesting question and one that we could spend hours sort of discussing. But the 30,000-foot view is that there was a growing realization that there were concerns around building quality in Australia. And so there's been numerous studies in the past. I think the most notable or recent one, at least, was the Shergold-Weir report, the Building Confidence Report. And that really unearthed some pretty concerning aspects. And I think the other catalyst for everyone's attention, obviously, was a number of prominent buildings that hit the press in terms of material defects and issues and concerns. And so it had, the whole market up in arms about what is the underlying issue? Do we have a problem? How pervasive and systemic is it? And how do we actually overcome it? And so the Centre for International Economics went and was commissioned to do an assessment of what's the size or the quantification of the problem. I mean, how prevalent is this? Are we talking about a couple of outliers, or is it far more systemic? And I think all the various government agencies and jurisdictions, regulators across the country have also been increasing their reviews of what is the prevalence of defects in terms of their regulatory surveillance activities. But circling back on the CIE report quantifying defects, they identified that it was about $2.5 billion per annum of the residential built environment, right? That's
wow.
Serious dollars. And so in a season where, buyers, consumers have been concerned about, are they engaging with a bad actor who could potentially, run away from the country? Are they dealing with someone that's done this before, a repeat offender? You might have heard in the press, comments around Phoenix operators where they've burned a company and left harms behind, but then just rebirth and do it all again. So there's, consumers have been concerned about what is the quality, what's the reliability, what's the propensity of, the builder or developer to actually do the right thing, to stick around, and hopefully they're around in the next 5-10 years to be able to remediate if, heaven forbid, there was a problem. And I think that given the complications in the construction industry in the main, I think it's well publicised, the issues around the challenges that industry is grappling with. But we are continuing to see, substantially elevated insolvency rates in the construction industry as well. And so buyers, are concerned. They're concerned about will their developer, will their builder be solvent? Are they going to stick around for the next 5 to 10 years to address any issues? And so we see in terms of some research from YouGov, actually, that was prepared for Equifax, we found that, about 80% of consumers and buyers, 80% were really concerned about the developer or the builder's solvency. We saw 85% of that demographic were really concerned about the build quality. And are there distressed builders out there that are cutting corners and doing the wrong thing? And the trump card there was 90% were concerned about whether they could trust their builder or developer. And so trust as a credential has become, first and foremost, I think, in everyone's minds when they're engaging in, arguably the biggest investment of their life is, can they trust who they're engaging to build their forever home?
It's quite astounding when you think of it that we've had a lot of construction in this country over the last decades. And even though there's not a high degree of trust in this sector, yet buildings still get built, apartments get sold, and the market keeps turning over. Now, in New South Wales, it's been quite highly publicised that, we had a building commissioner who's since retired. Now we've got a new building commissioner. There's been a lot of changes in New South Wales, which I've had a lot of comments that those changes have not necessarily been replicated or recognised or followed that lead has not been followed by other states. But there's been a real public attempt from the government's point of view to address this systemic issue of build quality in the apartment space in particular in New South Wales. And I think they have moved into house and land packages. But that's just the tip of the iceberg, isn't it? That's currently built properties will be, benefiting from that. And of course, what the two disasters that you referred to early on was Mascot Towers and Opal Towers, which was, I think, back in 2018 and 2019, if my memory serves me correct. So here we are still talking about this issue. So let's take a deeper look into building defects because, as I mentioned, New South Wales has tackled this problem head on, whereas I don't really know what the other states are at. How do you get intel into builders and developers that don't do the right thing? I know that New South Wales has been very proactive of building lists, but what about other states? And can consumers rely on the information that you've got as being complete?
Yeah, I think it's good to know and to be reminded, I think, Veronica, that there is a lot of very good, reliable and trustworthy developers and builders out there.
Yeah.
And later I can unpack some of the stats that talk about, what that actually looks like. But as a teaser for some details later on, we see that about 3/4 of the industry are actually exhibiting the types of behaviours that our consumers, that buyers really want to see. And it's always the question, isn't it? It's the 80-20 rule. It's the 20 that have been cutting corners and doing the wrong thing that actually impacts the whole industry. So the other 80% generally are tarnished with that same brush of those bad actors. And so it has been a real challenge, but therein lies too the solution for buyers and for industry in being able to demonstrate their trust credentials. And, kudos to a number of different government agencies and regulators across the country that have really been looking at this space and identifying what are things that we can do to really course correct some of the challenges that have been building up over many years in that sort of purported race to the bottom. How do we actually support industry by putting in place the right mechanisms to help do a level set to ensure a fair and equitable playing field where bad actors can't come to market with heavily discounted properties because they've cut out some corners in the process, leaving consumers harmed, really damaging the industry's reputation as a whole. And New South Wales has been arguably a leader in that space, not just recognised nationally, but also internationally from prominent world leaders in the UK and other markets about the reforms that have been taking place over here. So that's really encouraging. And it's also been encouraging to see the extent to which industry bodies, associations, as well as market associations and the public sector at large have really been earnestly trying to collaborate to work together to solve for this problem. But I think, Veronica, you shared in your opening sort of comments that it is a sector which for a very long time has been criticised for being quite opaque. There's not a lot of readily available information that consumers or the broader market are able to access. And so again, we know from some research from YouGov that identified that 84% of consumers, of buyers, are really looking for reliable information, independent sources to understand the credentials and the trustworthiness of those that they're going to move ahead with. And so understanding not only the concerns of buyers, but importantly, what is it that they really need to be confident in that important decision. So I think your question was what are the various components or aspects that that iCIRT as a tool uses to provide that confidence to consumers around the builders and the build quality, and how reliable, I think you'd said it was that information. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, I'll give you sort of some context here too, because, and I guess before you sort of get into that, I want to sort of tease out more of the issues, more of the problems, and more of the challenges for buyers, because house and land is actually different to apartments, for example. I mean, somebody buys a house and land package, they've at least got homeowners warranty insurance, so they've got some degree of protection, whereas anybody who buys an apartment, if it's 4 stories or higher, there's none of that, So but also a lot of consumers assume they have these protections, and that's obviously not sufficient anyway, should there be defects. And then there's the whole insolvency thing with obviously people waiting for their properties to be built still that have paid the deposits and even paid progress payments. So I want to tease more of that out. But certainly I know myself in my buyer's agency business, when you're looking at, a situation with Opal Towers and Mascot Towers back in, beginning of this podcast, actually, we had a lot of interviews at the time and a lot of discussions at the time. Very, very, tragic and very dramatic as well. The very fact you got entire buildings evacuated, one on Christmas Eve, right? So then in my business, because we have a huge focus on due diligence in my business, and every time we learn something new, we think, okay, what do we need to do then to apply into our due diligence process to make sure that we are covering off on anything that is discoverable in that process of doing due diligence? And we don't look at brand new properties. We don't buy off the plan. But we do buy properties that are, say, within 10 years old or 12 years old or 20 years old. And Mascot Towers was 12 years old when it started sinking. So therefore, we had to start looking, well, how can we find out information? How do we first find out who the builder or developer was? And then, there's all these Phoenix companies that you talked about, and good developers use Phoenix companies because, I've spoken to lawyers who say they'd be idiots if they didn't, so the system was set up in a way that made it very difficult to find information. And I remember back then thinking, I don't know. We have to then really show our clients we have no way of finding out this information and giving you any comfort as to whether it was a good builder, isn't a good builder. We can't even find the builder half the time. So there was the lack of that information became starkly obvious to me at that time. So that's why I'm really keen to understand how you guys go about getting your information on builders and whether there's any holes in that, whether there's any gaps that consumers need to be aware that there's still no certainty.
Well, I think it perhaps is a good segue into the origin of the tool. How did it come to support the sort of broader market? And it really began in earnest probably about nearly 6 years ago, where there was a collaboration of government agencies and the private sector industry bodies at the time, recognizing there was a problem. And so the challenge was, how do we actually course correct the significant erosion of confidence in construction? And so through a number of years, there were a multitude of roundtables where stakeholders were working together, funders, insurers, regulators, industry bodies, market associations, a lot of professional firms, all coming together with the intent of saying, what does good look like? What are the attributes of a reliable, trustworthy developer? Conversely, what does bad look like?
Yeah.
And how do we make sure we've got a clear line of sight to those that are exhibiting those sorts of behaviors, those characteristics that are untoward? And we know, unfortunately, from the data that construction does tend to be a little overweight in its contribution towards things like, bad debts, harms caused, the allegations of misconduct. And again, this comes from ASIC's records, right? So when you look at all the various collapses that have occurred, 30% of all allegations of misconduct are towards construction businesses. So
Wow.
historically, there are and there have been some bad actors that have tarnished the reputation, unfortunately for all. But the good news is that there is a line of sight that can instill confidence in consumers and purchasers, and that's the intentionality of the independent construction industry ratings tool. So working collaboratively with that cohort, we identified what are the key attributes, and there's 150 of them, across 6 core criteria to really determine, is this a developer, a builder, a consultant, an architect, engineer, certifier, etc., that is exhibiting the sorts of characteristics that are going to lead to the right outcome. A safe, durable, reliable, quality asset. And so, again, it's looking at the people behind the business and what's their track records. What are the business ventures that they've been involved in before? Have they caused harm before? Have they wound down businesses before their statutory obligations had expired? Have they gone into either personally or through other ventures, periods of hardship that has left people exposed? So it's looking at their backgrounds and their experience and their credentials. And so that's what we call character. We're looking at the people behind the business. But then we're also looking at the business itself and saying, what's your experience? What's your track record? What sorts of projects or built assets have you delivered to the market? Where, when, what typology, what size? Has there been latent issues or defects? So what's the performance on those various buildings that they've developed? And that's what we call capability. We look at the governance and the oversight, the quality assurance programs, the defect remediation activities, all which get confidence around the quality of the built asset. But we're also looking at another element that we call conduct. And so we're saying, what are your behaviors? You're honoring all of your obligations? Are you doing the right thing? You're paying people on time?
Yeah.
Your staff, your subcontractors, what's your contracting model look like? Have you got aged debts or outstanding issues? Are you in the tribunal or in the courts? Is there a lot of litigation? What's your track record with the regulators around compliance breaches and penalty notices and prohibitions or undertakings? So there's a lot of data that we also use across regulators, legal sources, courts records, tribunal records. Or what's the conduct as well as their credit records? But it's also important for them to have the resourcing, the people, the project teams with the right skill sets. And again, it comes back to the people that are involved here. What are the various background checks on those persons? All which have an important part to play in the quality of that built asset. So we're looking at the capacity to build, as well as the funding behind that. What's their equity, their capitalization, their cash flows, their margins? So they are a viable business that's going to be around in the many, many years to come. Heaven forbid something be wrong. They've got they'll be around to deal with that, right? So that's what we call the capital, and their access to borrowing lines, their collateral that they've got. But then it's important that, buyers and consumers also think about the key trading partners, who else they're working with. And again, we see from the data that trustworthy operators, those that are exhibiting the sorts of characteristics of delivering reliable quality built assets, they do tend to collaborate in terms of the correlation. They do tend to collaborate with other more trustworthy, reliable businesses. But the correlation is even stronger at the other end of that spectrum, right? Where there's arguably those that are exhibiting high risk attributes are seen to be engaging and working in partnership with others that are also demonstrating high risk attributes. And so we're
Birds of
looking
a feather.
Absolutely. So we're looking at what does that connectivity piece look like to those that they're also engaging and working alongside or with in bringing built assets to market. And we call that counterparties. So across those 6 criteria, the character, the capability, the conduct, the capacity, the capital, and the counterparties, there's a whole array of data attributes behind those, which using thousands and thousands of data sources, all which were opined as being or determined to be important and relevant when determining whether society, looking after the public trust, could know that they're dealing with a reliable, trustworthy developer, builder, or building professional consultant in the space. So that's
It mustn't be cheap to get yourself, and is it optional for these developers and builders to sort of get this rating system? I mean, it's a bit self-fulfilling if you do get a good rating, right? Then I want to be on there. I can then use it as part of my marketing. I can sort of, we're already doing it anyway, so we're not going to have any issues with it. So, but, is it a prohibitive for, and do you find that a lot of the dodgy ones just avoid it because there's no obligation to join? Like, how does that all play out?
So I think the intentionality, let me talk about some of the different states and territories, right? I think they're all at various stages of their reform and the way in which they're looking at co-regulatory mechanisms, like ratings, like insurance, to provide support to the market. And so it's in New South Wales, as you'll know, it was introduced as a voluntary regime. There was a lot of debate at the time from consumer associations and representatives versus industry. Should this be mandated? Should it be voluntary? How does it work? But equally too, in the policy agenda, it is also clear that there is a desire and an appetite by the government to be working towards market maturity, defined as where there's a very strong level of adoption by industry of the iCIRT rating service or ratings in order to instill that improved transparency to the broader market. At the moment, in terms of the adoption, we've got about 35% of, in New South Wales, of all builders and developers that are medium or larger, defined as those that have got a project pipeline of at least 5 million, right? So if you've got a project pipeline of 5 mil, then you're in that cohort. We've got coverage of about 35%. Collectively, in aggregate, that represents nearly 2/3 of the entire residential building market by value.
Yeah.
Right. So naturally, in that cohort of 35, there'll be some big players in that space, right? But to your question, Chris, arguably, is there some sort of potential positive affirmation bias here where the good developers, or builders will be readily embracing this and some of those, those that might not be exhibiting the sorts of characteristics that we'd all hope to see would be shying away from it. And what we found early in the piece was that, in fact, it was almost a flip side. There was a flood of those that had some bad PR and were looking like, we need to course correct this misrepresentation of our business. And so in the early months, we'd actually found that there was a huge flood of businesses that had a very bad track record and not understanding were they going to be able to get through, and they could say, we're good to go. We've got our ratings, so leave us alone. But overall, when we looked at tens of thousands of construction businesses through the iCIRT, the rating tool, we found that it was about 25%, just under, about 25% were exhibiting the trustworthy credentials on the basis of that collaborative group's design, a co-designed framework with government, with industry, about what does good look like. So it was about 3/4. Now, in the early days, it ratcheted up a little bit in terms of what we're seeing around the voluntary parties, and then it went back to arguably some level of normalization. Fast forward to where we are today, we're probably seeing about 27%, maybe 28% of those coming through are not able to either maintain their trustworthy credentials or have not been able to obtain their trustworthy credentials. And so when we look at those that have been coming each year to be re-rated, there's some good news and some challenges. The good news is we've been seeing growing signs and evidence of them lifting their capability, hardening their controls, strengthening their governance, putting in place a different type of contracting model with different checks and balances to ensure there's a high level of quality assurance. So it's good to see the way in which they've been taking on board the ratings rationale, what are some of the constraints of the rating, and working on those aspects to further improve the value of their business and provide greater confidence to the market. And so that's been really good. The problem has been during the last couple of years, I don't think it's a surprise, the industry has really been grappling with a multitude of challenges, but that's led to an erosion of their underlying financial fundamentals. And as a result of that, it's created some increased risk in some of those other criteria, like capacity and capital. And so there's this mix, if you will, of improvement but some deterioration. And so over the long term, we're continuing to see about 3/4 are exhibiting the right behaviours, but it sort of does ebb and flow a little bit on the basis of how the industry is performing. And that kind of feeds a little bit into the insolvency story as well.
So I've got an understanding of the construction industry I've been exposed to the last 10, 12 years with a partner of mine, and and they're a great build-up. And But just through working with them, I understand that it's not always up to just being a great builder, right? Like you've got individual projects and developers, and particularly when you are a builder, like you go and price the job and then you get hit with weather and materials, and so that you can have job problems and you can, so that doesn't mean that you're not a great builder though. And there's pressure on time and delays are costly, etc. like that. So how do you sort of give consumers, confidence when, even if you're a great builder or a developer, sometimes jobs just go bad. And is it how a builder and developer deals with that, like that the bad job, and how they look after consumers? Is that what you're sort of looking for? Is look at, it's not a developer with 100% clean record that's never had any defects, but it's the ones that when they do have defects, they don't run away.
Yeah, a good question, Chris. Look, I'm yet to come across a situation where we've assessed or rated a builder or a developer that has at least been around for a couple of years where they haven't had a project that's had problems. Like, I guess what you're alluding to is what I might call a unicorn. I haven't seen one yet. And I've been in this space here at the firm for 23 years, leading ratings. And with a very heavy focus on the construction industry. And so it's very normal and natural for businesses to be, as you described, having projects that have either delayed, that might have issues, that might be over budget and issues that they're working through, all kind of normal. The question is, have they got the willingness to step in and do the right thing? And can they demonstrate and evidence that consistently over time? And have they got the capacity to do so? So if you've got a significant concentration risk where your cash flows, you might be thinly capitalized, your cash flows are so dependent on one big job. Heaven forbid there's an issue with that one big job, the contagion risk to your overall other project work could be in jeopardy. So a big part of the process is saying, what's the level of resilience? What are your reserves? Because everyone is going to have projects that don't go according to plan. Unfortunately, it's just, there's so many exogenous factors. You mentioned weather. There's so many exogenous factors. So the question isn't so much, are we looking for a clean skin? Because they don't exist. The question is, what's their willingness and their capacity, their capability to actually come back and make good and or get things back on track? And so that's an important part of the iCIRT rating process, is looking at that.
I'm on a personal mission to help more people make better property decisions. Most people don't realise that they can cost themselves hundreds of thousands of dollars over the medium to long term when they make property decisions without all of the information that they need. And what I do is help people with tricky real estate problems, which often masquerade as simple questions like, should I sell my investment property because the interest repayments are hurting? Or should I buy before I sell? Or the other way around. You can connect with me and access all of the tools that I've created to help you make better property decisions at veronicamorgan.com.au. And there you will find resources for first home buyers, details about my buyer's agent mentoring program. You can connect with my Sydney-based property management and buyer's agency teams, Australia-wide vendor advocacy, or ask me for introduction to the small group of buyer's agents that I would personally recommend across the country. That's veronicamorgan.com.au.
If you're looking to buy your first home, thinking of upgrading to a new one, or purchasing an investment property anywhere in Australia, we would love to carefully guide you through this journey and, importantly, get the finance right. Reach out via my website, alcove.com.au.
So I have to say, you went through those 6 areas of criteria, and I was like, oh, that's fantastic. We should be doing that for buyer's agents and mortgage brokers, because just having that industry input to establish what those criteria are. And it's so that's exciting, right? And that in itself gives me confidence, I mean, I've been fortunate enough to actually have a fantastic builder, but I wonder though, so they've got to pay for it. My nat, and I'm not an economist, but I do go to incentives, and I think so. If they've got to pay for it, the incentive of the rating organisation could be to give them the tick so that they can then have ongoing membership and training and all that sort of palaver. So I guess I'd like to know how you sort of counter that. But I'm also wondering, it's voluntary, which is great. And I'm glad to hear that the better operators are starting to line up for it, not just those who want the tick to validate their poor performance. How do you get the information? Obviously they have to sign away their privacy on certain things to say, yes, you can have access to my bank, you can access to my insurance, you can have access to all sorts of other forms of gaining data. There's software, project management software, I imagine, employment records. There's so many things. Do you have a physical inspector that goes and works through a big list, or is a lot of this stuff digital?
Yes, good question. So I'll start with your first question, I think, Veronica, which was, the credentials. How do you avoid the inherent conflicts of interest when you're being paid by the very parties that you're rating? And I think that right at the very beginning of this journey, there was a lot of questions around what are the right attributes and the right rating framework? What's the right rating process? But then secondly, what are the right rating providers? How do we make sure that we've got the right levels of independence, integrity, and quality of the process? It's got
also experience, right? If you've got human beings involved, they've got to be able to not be hoodwinked.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's where there was some very good, in those roundtables of public and private sector contributors, we were fortunate as a global business that we could tap into, what's happening across different jurisdictions around the world. And so we had and facilitated a number of experts and or speakers contributing into that body of knowledge, that research about what's happening in other jurisdictions, what's worked well, what has not worked well, because the problems that we're experiencing here in Australia are not unique to Australia. It's not a local problem. It's a global one. And so it was really fortunate to be able to pull together that expertise, those learnings. What's the regulatory reform journey? What are industry developments? How are firms supporting and building up confidence? Grenfell was certainly very prominent across the whole entire building industry on a global scale. And it's still, as you would be aware, it's still ongoing in terms of the ramifications and remediations into the future for the industry as a whole. And so what was helpful is to hear from the feedback across different jurisdictions, Singapore, Canada, Europe, the UK. And I'll use the UK as a good example. They'd said, look, following Grenfell, there was this erosion of confidence. Funders withdrew, insurers withdrew, consumers withdrew. There was a real crisis of confidence. And they knew that they needed to do something to arrest that erosion in confidence, to bring back confidence. And they knew that they needed to work on improving transparency and trust. And so a part of that, they introduced the opportunity for the market to provide rating services across the UK market. And there was a flurry and a flood of everybody coming to the table. There was social media channels, there was, trip view style reform, there was accounting firms, there was industry bodies. Everybody thought, what a great opportunity to monetize some harms. And it's like, oh, crikey.
Oh, no. I can just imagine too, the sort of all the poor quality of ratings from consumers that have gripes, or that they don't know that actually that's a good building. It's, if you compare it with all the others, they're highly fussy, or others that are too scared to rate. You know what I mean? Like, it's so open to being distorted. So I can see why the horror would be on the industry's eyes on that one.
So I think it was insightful to hear the lessons learned. And I think that the UK were able to share, while there was a lot of positivity early, and, insurers and funders and buyers, everyone was sort of leaning into this space and thinking, oh, good, this is good. It kind of all fell in a heap within sort of 6 to 8 months after. And the reason was because it wasn't a regulated space. Everybody could come. Yeah. It didn't matter about the expertise of the people doing the service. It didn't matter about their process or controls environment. There wasn't the right oversight around conflicts of interest and independence. And so here in this region, there's a number of state government agencies, regulators across the country that have recognized the importance of ensuring that they're working with providers that can evidence the right credentials. And so here in Australia, where the credit ratings industry is regulated by ASIC. We're regulated by ASIC here in Australia and New Zealand. We're regulated by the RBNZ as a licensed and regulated ratings agency to ensure the quality, the integrity, and the independence of rating outcomes. And so our controls environment is incredibly strong, with multiple lines of defense and independent audits and annual reports that go to the regulator about all those various audits. And so there's a lot of industry surveillance and regulatory oversight in terms of that industry. So that's, I think, the reason why the across Australia, the various government agencies and regulators have been looking to use the services of those that have been able to evidence that license and those credentials.
Yeah, I mean, because it does need oversight, and it obviously needs that to be respected and reliable. Otherwise, the credibility go out the window. Can we look into these insolvencies? Because in a way, like you alluded to before, they can sort of unravel. A good business can go insolvent. Particularly with the environment that we've had with the profitless boom that happened as a result of the government's COVID stimulus, home builder and that sort of thing. So we understand that people are still waiting for the homes to build or finish years after the builder's gone broke. And then there's possibly some other builders that are waiting for a bailout or teetering on the edge of being insolvent themselves. How does this, because I imagine there's some good builders that would have previously got a good rating, may not now, and some of that's not due necessarily to their own fault. It's really a perfect storm in many ways. But how can buyers protect themselves against such outcomes? Does somebody, signing up with a builder who rates well today, what's the guarantee that they're going to rate well tomorrow when they're not going to go insolvent in 2 years? And so I guess how does that all sort of play into this?
Yeah. All things being equal, higher rating outcomes demonstrate much higher levels of resilience. Lower rating outcomes exhibit higher levels of risk, and so hence lower capitalization, lower reserves, and a much greater level of or vulnerability to risk factors. So I think one of the questions is, what's the line of sight that can be afforded by ratings tools that can instill confidence in buyers? Because they're not just wanting to know, are they going to be around long enough to build the thing? They want to know, are they likely to be around long enough to not only build the asset, but then come back and address and make good any issues that might emanate later. And so, again, what we know is the data doesn't lie. When you're looking at the right information in the right way, you can find what is the likelihood of the vulnerability of that builder, that developer, that consultant to actually enter into a state of harm for themselves and other stakeholders involved with that business. As iCIRT as an example, we can see that more than 9 times out of every 10 of a construction collapse, more than 9 times out of every 10, you can see it at least a year off, and more often it's 2 to 3 years in advance of a collapse, like the likes of Porter Davis, like ProBuild. The list is long. There's tens of thousands of collapse constructors that we've looked at through that process, more than 9 out of 10. Well in advance, because again, there are early warning signs. If we go to, as an example, ASIC's records, and you look at all the external administrators and the reports they've lodged with ASIC, and they're looking at what are the evidences leading up to that state of collapse. And unfortunately, we know that when people are distressed, they often do the wrong thing.
Yeah.
We know that 9 out of 10 of those construction collapses has been allegations of misconduct. We know 8 out of 10 are about insolvent trading. And we also know the majority of those are well in advance, like 12 months plus.
Right.
So the information is there. So it's about using that information, again, in the right way to provide the right rating outcomes so that consumers can be confident moving forward. And I think that's where the strength of iCIRT comes, and why we're seeing such a strong impact that iCIRT is having to buyers and purchasers of residential property.
Do you think, Brad, that it's increasing the cost of construction? There's a real pressure on, the affordability part of, producing properties. Do you think that, is there's an argument that more regulation and more standards is going to increase us to do things and it's going to cost more to consumers? Obviously, I don't think that, but how do you sort of counteract that? And actually, no, it's more about getting quality. It's not about increasing the cost.
Like all things, Chris, I think there's always opportunities for reviewing the efficiency and the effectiveness of any sort of regime that might be in place. Now, what's really encouraging about government agencies is we are seeing a trend of how regulators are really starting to embrace data, analytics, and ratings to apply a risk-based surveillance. In other words, using the resource pool they have to ensure that it's targeted at those areas that are most likely to cause harm to the public. So that's really encouraging. So there's an improving level of effectiveness and efficiency through some of the ways in which they're now embracing and using data. But I think that coming back to your point around affordability, right, because it's a front and center of everyone's minds, and there's lots of data that we could talk about around affordability. But to your question about, is it likely to increase the cost to buyers as a result of having this improved transparency and supporting improved confidence. And I would argue it reduces the processing costs. And let me share with you how and why. At the moment, we have, let's say, somewhere in the vicinity of 20% of the market, which is out there showing higher risk attributes. We know that distressed people often do the wrong thing, causing harm to consumers today, unbeknownst to them of what they're going to be left with. And the reason consumers go with them is probably for two reasons. One, they're cheaper, and two, there's no service that enables them to more effectively discriminate between one or the other when there's a price differential. And so by being able to provide this improved transparency to enable those doing the right thing, not cutting corners or skipping out on key steps of quality assurance, that it actually level sets the playing field to ensure that it's fair and equitable, so that some of those bad actors are not out there doing the wrong thing, bringing cheap assets to market that are actually non-compliant and that are likely to lead to an increased prevalence of latent defects, right? So I think that's really good to see that through that process, you'll see a withdrawal. And I think that the government has recognised that, a withdrawal of those higher risk players from the market, no longer having the ability to necessarily participate in a market where they've got targets on their backs from the regulator using these types of data sets, but also because they're unable to obtain their credentials and win customer confidence in a market. Consumers, and buyers, there's a flight to quality in this market. They're looking for signs of trust and evidence of that trust. And so I would argue that it actually helps improve affordability by taking out the harms, by taking out the low-cost contributors to ensure that there's no longer the $2.5 billion worth of defects that, is lobbed on the market each year.
Is there any way for new to industry? Because, I guess one of your, I don't know if on the 6 points, it's, history, a track record, et cetera, which is great. If you've got a long-term, if you're going to get a 4 or 5 star and you've got that, great, this is great for you. But let's say you're a new to industry builder and developer, and we want to create more and more competition, right? It's free markets, it's better for consumers too. But is there a light version or a new to industry builder developer that can still get, rated, but maybe they don't get all the elements because they haven't got that track record? So you're still not stifling new entrants and, creating a club where it's good for all the people who have been around for a long time and not good for new people.
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. And that was one of the core design principles of the iCIRT rating proposition, was right at the very beginning, is to ensure that it was fit for purpose and proportional, but that it would also safeguard from unintended consequences and specifically enable the introduction, an on-ramp, if you will, for new to industry players in order to earn their credentials, maybe not initially, but at least over time with a lighter touch on-ramp. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But I think the elephant in the room is what you said a moment ago about, being here a long time is much more reliable, or being big is much more reliable.
Yeah.
And I think that, that those hypotheses have really been tested time and again to show it's not always the case. And again, COVID, we saw that more than 3 and a bit years in advance. This stuff's not a surprise, right? So having said that, the opportunity for new to industry is to go through the process. And for those that have worked in the construction industry, that have got that experience, when we go back to character, we're looking at their backgrounds. Where have you worked? With whom? For how long? What did you do? What was your role? We do the performance checks, so they get evidence. I might have only just started this building company, but I've actually been in the industry a long time, and I can show you my credentials and what I've worked on and where. So all of that bodes well. But if you're saying I've come from hospitality because I lost my job in hospitality, I've got a ute, I've got a shovel, now I'm off to spend $1 million of some poor consumer's money, that's going to be tough. They're not going to be able to evidence their capability. And so all things being equal, it's about making sure that there's a clear, outline of where are there some constraints today, and importantly, what's the roadmap for them to actually, over time possibly put in place the right capability sets, the right controls, the appropriate governance, the site supervision, the quality assurance, in order to ensure that there's, a good outcome in the end.
It's such I just love the sound of this, and I keep thinking, how good would it be in my space? So And obviously, you've got players that aren't rated. We've talked about what, say, 35% now are rated, and that covers off around 75% of work.
Two-thirds of the whole.
Two-thirds, so 66%. So you've still got a third of work that's out there performed by builders that are unrated, and by those numbers, the smaller builders, by the sounds of it. And again, some of those smaller builders might be great, but they haven't been tested, so they haven't actually gone through the system. Now, I'm curious because we talked about New South Wales a lot. Is this a national rating system? Is that figures across the board, or are there some states and territories where there's more of an uptake than less of an uptake? How does that sort of work across the country?
Yeah, so the intention behind iCIRT was always to be a globally facing multi-jurisdictional capability. Now, intentionally, our remit here is more Australia, New Zealand as a part of a global data analytics company, right? But our remit more in the sort of Australia, New Zealand region. So we've been, having and progressing a lot of very good, robust discussions across sort of the Trans-Tasman area. And we decided to launch initially in New South Wales. So we've seen great adoption and good traction that's continued to grow. And it's fair to say that we've had a lot of, some of this is on public record, but a lot of good engagement and consultation and conversations at the Commonwealth level, as well as across each of the various states and territories. And I think more of that will continue to be released to the market in due course. It wouldn't be appropriate for me to outline any of that at the moment per se, but in terms of the awareness, we know that in New South Wales, that 32% of consumers of the market, 32% are aware of these ratings tools of iCIRT.
Because that's the next thing, isn't it? If the consumers aren't aware, it doesn't matter.
No, that's right. But so we've still got more work to do, and we've been working with a number of primary channels straight to consumer markets, so REA and a number of other like realestate.com, working through a process of really helping build that awareness and continuing that journey. Now in Queensland, it's about the same. It's just a fraction under 32%. It's a bit more behind in Victoria. They used to be in front, actually. And I think that was possibly on the back end of some favourable news coverage that was showing in terms of some prominent collapses down there that iCIRT had called those out well in advance. But, but overall, we're really, it's good to see the way in which it is having a positive impact on consumers. And what we see, again, from the data from YouGov, they showed us that in terms of the confidence boost, for those that are iCIRT aware, 69%, so 7 out of 10, said they had improved confidence in moving forward with construction. 69% versus only 7% that were unaware of iCIRT having improved confidence in construction. So not aware of iCIRT, 7% improved confidence. Aware of iCIRT, 7 out of 10, 69%. So it's having a massive impact. We know that of that group, and we also know that more than 8 out of 10 are prepared to pay a bit more to know that they're actually engaging a reliable, trustworthy developer or builder, someone that's actually going to deliver an asset with a whole of life value to them that's likely to stand the test of time, as opposed to maybe saving at the front, going with an unknown, unrated player, only to be copped with a whole series of harms.
When buying off the plan, though, you don't get to choose your builder or your developer, right? And there's a difference between builders and developers. Some developers build, but often they're two different entities, right? So are developers rated as well as builders? So you get a rating for developer and a rating for builders. And how does a consumer of off the plan, is it something that they include in their marketing? Is that how it works in that scenario?
Yeah. So we're providing ratings to developers, to builders, to architects, engineers, certifiers, project managers, consultants. So there's iCIRT ratings are supporting all those aspects of that broader project team. Lloyds of London, they weren't the first to say this, but, following Grenfell, it was pretty clear that the quality of a built asset is only as good as its weakest link. And so that improved line of sight to the traceability of the trustworthiness, the credentials of all of those that have got an important part to play in that project player composition.
So does it include supply channels, though? Because Grenfell was clad in, in flammable pieces of, foam, aluminium covered foam, right? So like that could have been built by somebody who had an iCIRT rating, for example, because it's just that they happened to use a material that was proven to be highly dangerous,
So late last year, we actually released the scorecard specifically for trade and installation. And the intentionality was always, right from the very beginning, to include product manufacturers, the whole logistics supply chain. So when you're sourcing goods from a certain jurisdiction around the world, how is there confidence that it actually was what they thought they bought? So there's a whole series of trust mechanisms that work together in order to ensure that there's the confidence that consumers can have. So coming back to your question, though, in terms of developers and builders, yes, we're well entrenched in terms of rating both. And I think for consumers, when they're signing a contract, to make sure that they understand who is the legal party that they're actually entering into that contract with. Now, New South Wales, the government actually released some proposed clauseware that one of the big law firms here large Australian law firm, actually prepared some clauseware that purchasers could use in their contracts that enabled them, when they're putting down a deposit for an off-the-plan apartment, as an example, when they're putting down a deposit, to have a clause in the contract that enables them to withdraw and get their deposits back if the developer behind that or the builder behind that particular contract hadn't been able to obtain an appropriate or adequate iCIRT rating in the next six months. In other words, it afforded the party the time, the builder say, look, I'm trustworthy, you can take my word for it. But the consumer then says, but okay, sure, well, you can evidence that. You've got 6 months to evidence it. And if you can't evidence it in 6 months, then I can just get my deposit back. Thanks very much. That enables everyone to keep building with confidence and at the same time enable industry to work on anything they may need to work on, to put in place whatever they might need to put in place in order to ensure that they can legitimately, with integrity, then obtain the trust credentials to show and demonstrate back to purchasers, hey, I not only said I was, but I've now evidenced that through that independent licensed agency over there.
So I guess that's the big red flag, isn't it? For a consumer who's looking at buying a property like this and they don't have certification, you go, okay, well, I'm happy to buy it, but only if you insert this clause. I would imagine there'd be a huge amount of pushback from a number of them. And if the consumer is decided they love it, they don't care, they're going to go ahead with it anyway, because a lot of consumers don't recognize the risk that they're taking. But yeah, it's quite fascinating, and I think it's a great move. I really do think it's a great move. And obviously this podcast is, we're not here to promote businesses or services or anything like that. But however, I think this was a really good conversation to have, because I think we should be letting people know, what's behind this certification and to look for it, basically, because it's a hurdle that we would like our builders to be able to clear, really.
Brad, I mean, you're probably one of the best communicators we've ever had on this podcast, by the way. You're very, you've definitely extremely articulate, and there's so much knowledge going through your brain, and we could literally be here for hours, and there's so many other questions. Just putting, what you do day to day aside, the construction. What are the things that are, besides what you're doing, what are the other things you think as a broad industry we need to also be working on? Because there's so many facets to this, we need more supply, right? Like, that's reality. For affordability, for many reasons, we need to be building more, but there's a lot of things that we need to be working in conjunction.
A good question, Chris. I mean, look, there's so many avenues that we could talk about. We could talk about some of the geopolitical changes and tariffs that are coming through, impacting global supply chains, which impacts materials. And we see, as an example, various jurisdictions around the world looking at nearshoring, friendshoring, insourcing, that's impacting those global supply chains. Coming close, how does that impact us in construction or the price of property? That invariably is likely to have some impact on material prices as that continues to play out. There's also the issue around labour. We've got a pretty full employment market here. Our unemployment rates are down. Our underemployment is down. Our participation rate is up in highest levels in over a decade. Full labour market, but we don't have enough. We don't have enough people, trades, and people in the industry, but we also don't have enough businesses. When we look at the construction industry, we know that we've got to have businesses with capital that are employing the right labour in order to deliver the assets that we all need. And we do not have enough businesses with the right trust credentials. We don't have enough businesses to actually deliver the homes we need, especially when you look at the topology. Here, it's not just a matter of greenfields. We've got to keep building out. We actually have to also have urban infilling. We've got to have medium density and a lot more of it. And it's great to see the conversations across all the various states and territories around what can be done to accelerate, to fast track, to adjust planning reforms to support that activity. But we still need the builders. And then in that case, they've got to, where are they coming from?
You've also got productivity. You know,
Yeah,
so
I mean-
the construction industry, it falls every year, right? Productivity. So
Yeah, and there's a lot of waste. Like there's lots of studies that have shown, is it 12%, 13% of the project is, how
Wow.
do we recover some of that waste? How do we improve the productivity? There's a lot of different mechanisms. And again, we could be here for weeks unpacking all of the various functions and attributes that are either materials, or is it labor? Is it businesses? Is it the productivity? Is it waste? The social license aspect, what are some of those other aspects that are so, there's many and varied, Chris. It's hard to answer your questions succinctly with enough brevity to fit into your time slot.
will you come back and talk about
I
those
think,
things?
there's not many people we invite back while we're on the podcast, but I think you, Brad, you would definitely deserve another episode. But before we finish it, we like to end on something a little bit more lighter, because you were spinning my brain just there. Let's do a property Dumbo. Have you got one for us?
Look, I do, and I hope I retain my friendship with this person after this, if they happen to be listening. But I've got a close friend of mine who is a sophisticated investor, a big share portfolio, active across all of his various shares, and, masters in finance, so a relatively smart guy. And he bought a property without looking at it, without seeing it. It's a single dwelling,
God.
Northern Beaches, and a massive deposit. To his defense, his excuse is the fact that it was a hot market, everything was selling very fast, and he knew the location. The location. He knew the location. He knew how many beds it is. A 5-bed, perfect location. Done. There's my check. Because apparently the owner was saying, you've got to put down your deposit, big fat amount. If you want me to take this off the market, not go ahead, I need the deposit today, unconditional, sign here.
Oh, wow.
And so he was locked in. When he went and saw it, all sorts of issues, very dark, floorboards cracked in, no deck, like it was just a nightmare. And he thought the renovation cost to just get this to a saleable place was huge. And so then he was stuck in that position. Do I forfeit the deposit, or do I do the
wow.
Anyway, so the lesson learned is, for all of us, right, is we should always make sure we're doing our due diligence well in advance. The amount of due diligence we do when we're buying something from JB Hi-Fi, for goodness sake.
Oh my, I know people spend more time on a toaster than they do on a property. But what gets me about that is, like, he's a smart guy, sophisticated investor, finance educated. That's called overconfidence bias. I can do everything.
Yeah.
It's a good one. So why didn't he go look at it?
Because it wasn't even on the market yet. It was.
Oh my
it was about
God.
to go on the market,
Scarcity
and they
bias
said,
as well.
"Look, before it goes on the market, here's your choice," because everything he'd been going to bid on kept getting sold out before the first open. And so he said, the only way I can solve for that is I'll buy it before the first open.
So it's obviously a dud, right? Let's just call it that. And so the agent's probably got him in the ear, right? Because the agent's got, all right, I've got a hot buyer here. He's sophisticated, overconfidence buyer. Let's sell in this pancake, and let's tell him we can't look at it. Because oh no! So did he settle?
Got to get in quick. You got to get in.
I mean, everyone likes a happy ending, right? What happened?
Yeah, he did actually move ahead, and
he renovated it.
Paid a lot of money for renovations.
Okay,
is he living in it?
Yeah, now living in it.
Is he happy?
I hope, for my sake, I can retain that friendship. But anyway, I think lesson learned for everybody.
I might not see you on the beaches, but thanks, Brad, for coming on. I will definitely get another episode with you in the future if you've got time for it, and really enjoyed that. Thanks so much.
Very good. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Veronica.
Appreciate your time.
If you have a question that you'd like us to answer in an upcoming Q&A episode, you can send us a voicemail or written question via the website, theelephantintheroom.com.au, or you can email us directly at questions@theelephantintheroom.com.au. If you like what you're hearing, please share this episode with others you feel would benefit. And while you're at it, why not leave us an iTunes review? 5 stars would be great. I know that sounds a bit cringy, but we have it on good authority that every review helps make it easier for other people to find out about us and hear what our amazing guests have to say.